She rejected him in college, crushed his heart with a smile, and walked away like he never mattered. Years later, life throws them back together in the most unexpected way. She's now a caregiver, and he's the man she once called not enough. But this time, the roles are reversed, and the truth is deeper than she ever imagined. Old wounds resurface, sparks reignite, and one secret could change everything. Brew your favorite cup of coffee, get comfortable, and prepare to dive into a story where love grows in the most unlikely places. And don't forget to subscribe. Andrew Carter stood across the wide stone steps of the Literature and Arts Building at the University of Michigan, holding a manila folder pressed to his chest like it might contain the secret to happiness. Snow had fallen that morning, soft and lazy, coating the lawns in a powdery white that glittered in the December sun. His breath curled in the air as he waited, shifting his weight from foot to foot, nerves tapping out their own private rhythm. Then he saw her, Valerie Blake, gliding out the heavy oak doors like she was stepping into a movie scene. Her scarf trailed behind her like a ribbon, and the sound of her heels against the pavement was so precise, so deliberate, it made the rest of the world sound muffled. "You look even more beautiful today than you did yesterday," Andrew said, trying to strike the perfect mix of confident and casual. Instead, he sounded breathless, like he'd just sprinted across campus. Valerie didn't stop walking. She barely glanced at him, offering a smirk without breaking stride. "You say that every day." "Because it's true every day," he replied quickly, walking beside her now. He offered the folder. "I stayed up all night finishing this. Your senior paper. Proofread. Formatted. Even added references in MLA." She took it with one perfectly gloved hand and didn't look inside. "Thanks, I'll skim it before I submit, if I have time." Andrew tried to laugh, but it came out too eager. "Well, if I can help you avoid another scathing comment from Professor Lindell, my job is done." They walked toward the parking lot in silence until he added, "Hey, I heard there's a screening tonight at the Michigan Theater. Classic love story. Full of old school charm, candlelight, that kind of thing. Wanna go?" Valerie made a face. "I don't do melodrama, Andrew." Her tone wasn't cruel, just final. She flashed that dazzling smile he had memorized like a line from a sacred book, then turned and disappeared into the back seat of a waiting black Lexus, driven by a guy in a leather jacket who didn't even glance at Andrew. Andrew stood alone in the fading afternoon light, the cold finally reaching through his coat. His fingers tingled, but it wasn't from the temperature. He knew what people saw when they looked at Valerie. Rich girl, daddy's car, daddy's money. The kind of girl who had private tennis lessons by 12 and designer boots by 14. What they didn't see was how her eyes softened when she talked about her dog growing up, or how she once blushed, really blushed, when he made a joke about Plato's love life in ethics class. He'd been in love with her since sophomore year. Not a crush, not a passing thing. Love. The kind that made him show up to campus 2 hours early just to make sure she had a good seat in lecture. The kind that made him skip shifts at the auto shop to retype her notes when she accidentally lost them. And today, giving her that paper, offering her that chance at a date, it felt like a last stand. The bus ride home was slow. It always was. He watched his breath fog the glass as they crossed over the Huron River, thinking about how she hadn't even looked at the earrings. They were tucked inside the folder. Small silver crescents, delicate, simple. He'd seen them at the flea market 3 weeks ago and spent every spare evening hauling boxes at McCullough's Hardware to afford them. Valerie wore expensive things, but these had felt right. She liked the moon. She once said so during a boring astronomy lecture, tracing it into the corner of her notebook while pretending to take notes. The next morning, he saw her again in the library. He dropped off the folder, watched her take out the earrings without a flicker of surprise or appreciation, and tucked them into her purse like spare change. "You didn't have to," she said flatly, her eyes scanning something on her phone. "But thanks." He left without a word. The following weeks passed in a blur of final exams and snowstorms. Andrew threw himself into study, work, anything that didn't involve seeing her again. But he couldn't help it, he still looked for her. In lecture halls, at the cafe, even in the dining hall, knowing full well she didn't eat there. Graduation came with more pomp and champagne than emotion. Valerie laughed with her crowd of friends, girls with gold watches and boys in tailored suits. Andrew hovered at the edge of it all, his diploma clutched like a passport to nowhere. That night, their class gathered for dinner at a downtown restaurant lined with Edison bulbs, and the buzz of too many people pretending to be more grown-up than they felt. He saw her across the room. Same elegance. Same effortless command of every gaze around her. He approached anyway. "Valerie," he said quietly. She turned, a flash of recognition in her eyes. "Andrew, hey." He took a breath. "I've loved you for 3 years, maybe more. I've tried to be patient, respectful, helpful. I know I'm not like the guys you usually talk to. But I'm not playing games. I want to build a life with you." She blinked, stunned for a moment. Then her lips parted into a half-smile, half-winced apology. "You're sweet, Andrew. Really. But we're from different worlds. And love doesn't pay bills or buy houses in Lincoln Park." He felt the words like slaps, cold and deliberate. "I need someone who speaks the same language as me," she continued, her voice cool. "You're a nice guy, but that's not enough. I'm sorry if that's harsh." He nodded, not trusting his voice. The room was too loud, the lights too hot. He backed away before she could see his eyes. That was the last time they spoke. At least for a very long time. The first signs that her world was cracking appeared on a warm spring afternoon, 3 years after graduation. Valerie had just stepped out of her Pilates class when her mother called. Her voice trembled, sharp around the edges like broken glass. "He's gone," she said. Valerie's breath caught. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Your father, he left. Just packed a suitcase and said he'd had enough. He's been seeing someone, Valerie. For a while, apparently." The phone slipped from Valerie's hand and bounced off the sidewalk, but she barely noticed. Her father, Charles Blake, wasn't the kind of man who just left. He brokered real estate deals on the golf course, wore cufflinks engraved with his initials, and treated the word obligation like scripture. He was dependable, predictable, the foundation beneath her feet. Until he wasn't. By the end of that week, it was public. Her mother received divorce papers from a downtown firm with more glass than soul. The house in Winnetka, the one with 6 bedrooms, imported marble, and a sunroom that her father never sat in, was still technically theirs, but bills started arriving. Mortgage, landscaping, staff, maintenance. Then came the real blow. He wasn't going to support them. Not a dime more. He kept the cars, the stocks, the vacation home in Lake Geneva. Left them the house, yes, but also the costs that came with it. Valerie remembered standing in the foyer one evening, looking at the towering ceiling and feeling for the first time that luxury could be suffocating. She and her mother moved through rooms like ghosts, knowing every chandelier was now a debt hanging above their heads. 6 months later, the house was sold to a neurosurgeon and his influencer wife. Valerie helped her mother pack crystal glassware into boxes and didn't cry when the moving truck pulled away. They relocated to a smaller condo downtown. 3 bedrooms, older appliances and windows that looked directly into another brick wall. It was the first time Valerie had ever lived somewhere she couldn't host a party. They had enough money from the house sale to coast for a while. A long while, actually, if you weren't addicted to $400 skincare and sushi delivery 4 nights a week. Valerie told herself it was temporary. A phase, a valley between two hills. But valleys can be deep. The first time she tried to get a job in her field, she wore a cream blazer and heels that clicked like confidence. She walked into a marketing firm with her head held high, smiling like a woman who used to be somebody. The interview was cordial. She was let go 3 weeks later. The second job lasted longer, 6 weeks. The boss was a woman named Diane who wore flannel and had no time for college princesses. Valerie tried harder this time. Showed up early, took notes, read manuals. She still got fired. Diane's exact words, "You look at people, but you don't hear them. You don't belong here." The third job ended with a door closing softly behind her and a man in his 50s shaking his head. "You've got a degree, Miss Blake, but you don't have a clue how the world works." That night, Valerie sat on the floor of her kitchen, sipping boxed wine and staring at a bottle of nail polish she hadn't used in months. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat, frozen in the quiet, wondering when exactly the world had stopped bending to her. Her mother had started seeing someone new, a dentist, gentle, boring, and barely spoke of Charles anymore. Valerie found herself alone more and more until she took on a roommate just to split the rent. Nadia was younger, chipper, worked 2 jobs, and called her Val within 3 hours of moving in. One evening, Valerie admitted the truth to her. "I think I'm officially unemployable." Nadia, perched cross-legged on the couch, looked at her like a project with potential. "You ever thought about caregiving?" Valerie blinked. "Like wiping noses and feeding people soup." "Well, yeah, but also just being there. A companion. There's this agency I work for, Heart and Hands. We do short and long-term placements. It pays better than you'd think, and they're always looking." Valerie scoffed. "You do that." "I love it," Nadia said with a shrug. "It's not glamorous, sure, but I make people's lives easier, and that feels pretty good." The suggestion clung to Valerie like the scent of cheap perfume, annoying at first, then oddly comforting. She didn't make a decision that night. But a week later, when her bank account dipped below the triple digits and her credit card pinged with a declined charge for groceries, she sent in the application. The interview was simple. A middle-aged woman in a navy cardigan asked her if she was kind. Patient, willing to learn. Valerie nodded to all 3. A background check later, she was hired. Her first assignment came a few days later in a manila envelope. Evanston, private residence. Client, Benjamin Carter. Age 78, stroke survivor. Requires light meal prep, assistance with mobility, and companionship. The name meant nothing to her. The address did. She'd driven past it once on the way to a charity gala years ago. The house had wrought iron gates and a circular driveway. It didn't look like a place that needed help. It looked like a place where help lived in the guest house. Valerie stood outside the gate on her first day, gripping her new ID badge and trying not to turn around. She was wearing flats instead of heels. Her nails were bare. And for the first time in her adult life, no one cared what brand her coat was. She rang the bell. The gate opened. And her new life, strange and unfamiliar, began. The house was older than it looked from the street. Brand, yes, but lived in. Valerie stepped inside and was immediately met by the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that whispered peace, but the kind that felt like a pause, like the house itself was holding its breath. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and something softer, like old paperbacks in time. A woman in scrubs met her near the staircase. "You're the new girl?" she asked, not unkindly. Valerie nodded. "Mr. Carter's in the sunroom. I've been with him for 2 weeks, filling in. He likes his toast dry and his eggs soft. Doesn't like pity. He's sharper than he lets on. You'll be fine." She handed Valerie a small file, clapped her on the shoulder once, and walked out like she hadn't just handed her the keys to someone else's entire world. Valerie stood there for a moment, staring down the hallway before walking toward the sunroom. He was seated in a recliner, a blanket over his legs, and a small oxygen tank humming softly beside him. His eyes, clear, pale blue, followed her as she stepped in. "You must be the girl from the agency," he said. His voice was gravel with a bit of pride still lodged in the cracks. "I'm Valerie," she said, stepping forward. He nodded. "Ben." He didn't offer to shake her hand, and she didn't reach for his. Something about his expression told her that dignity mattered here, even when the body couldn't quite keep up. The first few days were a blur of small tasks: measuring pills, adjusting pillows, warming soup. Ben didn't say much at first, and Valerie didn't press. She read to him sometimes, mostly old history books that he'd collected over the years. He'd interrupt her now and then to correct a date or offer a side note. "Lincoln wasn't tall," he said once, with a wry smile. "Everyone else was just short back then." By the end of the week, she was moving more comfortably through the house. She began noticing details. The framed photo of a boy fishing with his dad near Lake Michigan. A stack of gardening magazines on the kitchen counter. A worn leather wallet that looked like it had seen 1,000 miles of someone's life. But it was the balcony that changed things. On a cool April morning, she opened the French doors in the back hallway and stepped outside. The view was postcard perfect. Lush lawn, winding stone paths, and gardens that looked too carefully planned to be wild, but too full of life to be staged. She leaned on the railing, breathing in the scent of damp soil and early tulips, and then movement. Someone was in the garden. He was kneeling by the roses, in jeans and a gray thermal, dirt smudged on one sleeve. His back was to her, but something about the way he moved made her pulse stutter. He stood, brushing his hands on his pants, and turned toward the house. Valerie's stomach dropped. Andrew. He hadn't changed much. His jaw was a little more defined, his posture more sure. But the eyes, still that soft, searching brown, met hers and froze. He didn't smile. Neither did she. For a moment, they just stared, like two people trying to understand how the universe could twist time this way. He was the first to speak. "Valerie." Her name left his lips like a question, like he wasn't sure if she was real. She swallowed, suddenly very aware of how unpolished she must look. No makeup, hair tied back, scrubs loose around her frame. "Andrew," she managed. What are you doing here?" "I work here," he said, wiping his hands on a towel hanging from his belt. "Landscaping. Been helping out with the property the past couple months." A pause. Then her voice came, a little steadier. I'm caring for your father." Something flickered across his face, shock, recognition, something else. But he nodded. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said simply. "Same." He took a few steps closer until they were standing on either side of the garden fence. "You okay?" She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the first time anyone had asked her that in weeks. Maybe longer. "I'm fine," she said, "or I'm learning to be." Andrew studied her face, and she saw the gears turning. Whatever judgment might have risen, he buried it. "Well," he said after a beat, "guess we'll be seeing each other." and then he turned back to the roses. The rest of the day was strange, disjointed. Valerie fumbled a tea kettle, forgot to turn off a burner. Ben noticed. "You okay?" he asked from his recliner, squinting at her over the top of his book. "I saw someone I used to know," she said. "That a good thing or a bad thing?" She smiled faintly, still deciding. He chuckled. "Life's funny like that. People come back when you least expect 'em, and usually when you're least ready." The next morning, Andrew was there again, and the morning after that. He'd come around the side of the house with a small cart of tools, wave through the window, and start pruning the boxwoods. She'd find excuses to linger in the kitchen a little longer, wiping down a clean counter or reorganizing already neat cabinets. Sometimes he'd come in for water. Sometimes he'd sit with her for 5 minutes over lukewarm coffee. They talked. About books. About how Ann Arbor winters never really ended. About nothing and everything. And little by little, Valerie began to feel something loosen in her chest, something that had been locked away since the day her father walked out and the world stopped fitting around her the way it used to. One morning, as Andrew trimmed the azaleas, Ben watched from the sunroom window. Valerie stood beside him, watching too. "Interesting guy," Ben murmured, without turning. She started, then stopped. Ben smiled. "He's got roots here. Deep ones. You can feel it." Valerie looked at him, confused. Ben turned slightly, eyes twinkling with something she couldn't quite read. "He's a good man," he said. "Not just because he plants things, but because he sticks around to see them grow." She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know what she was feeling. But she knew one thing for certain. Andrew Carter was back in her life, and she wasn't ready to let him go a second time. Each morning began the same way now. Valerie would arrive just after sunrise, let herself in through the side entrance, and hang her coat on the wooden peg near the kitchen. By the time the kettle hissed and clicked, she could hear Andrew outside, his footsteps crunching along the gravel path that circled the flower beds. She never asked if he'd always been this punctual. She never mentioned that she now made 2 mugs of coffee by default. There was an ease in their routine, but beneath it ran a current of tension, not the kind that frays or wears, but the kind that hums quietly, the way old songs do when you haven't heard them in years but still know all the words. Some mornings they talked. Other times they just sat across from each other in the small breakfast nook, sipping their coffee and listening to the wind move through the trees. It was during those silences that Valerie felt most aware of the space between them, once so wide, now so tenderly close. She wasn't sure when exactly she stopped bracing herself. Maybe it was the afternoon he helped her carry a heavy case of water bottles into the kitchen. Or maybe it was the evening he fixed the broken porch light without being asked. Or the way he always looked her in the eye, not with pity or judgment, but with something gentler, familiar, like he remembered who she'd been and saw who she was becoming. It had been over a week since their surprise reunion, and yet they hadn't spoken directly about their past. Not the university, not the paper he wrote, not the earrings still sitting in a box somewhere in the back of her drawer. They were orbiting the truth, both too careful to land. Until the rainy Thursday. The sky had been sulking all morning, and by noon the heavens cracked open with a downpour. Andrew had been pruning a stubborn hedge by the garage and came inside soaked through, his flannel clinging to his frame, his hair dripping into his eyes. Valerie was drying dishes at the sink when he walked in, boots squelching against the tile. "Looks like spring finally got serious," he said, shaking water off his sleeves. She glanced over her shoulder. "You're soaked." He grinned. What gave it away? She grabbed a clean towel and tossed it to him. He caught it one-handed and started drying his face. "Sit," she said. You're going to track mud through the whole house." He obeyed, peeling off his gloves and setting them beside her on the counter. For a moment, they just stood there, him dripping, her heart pounding like she'd run a mile. The kitchen was too warm. Or maybe it was just him. "You ever think about back then?" she asked quietly, surprising even herself. He looked up slowly, eyes searching hers. "Yeah," he said, "all the time." She nodded, swallowing. "I was not a great person." He didn't argue. That alone made her throat tighten. "I was proud," she went on, her voice barely above a whisper. "Spoiled, afraid of looking weak. Afraid of what people would say if I dated someone who didn't have a trust fund or a country club membership." Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I never cared about any of that, Val." "I know," she said, "and that's what made it worse. You were good to me, better than I deserved." He was quiet for a long moment. "I wasn't just in love with you," he said. "I believed in you." Valerie turned away, pretending to rinse a spotless mug. Her hands trembled under the water. "I don't expect anything now," he added gently. I'm glad you're here." She turned to face him, water droplets still glistening in his hair, his eyes impossibly open. "I'm glad you're here too," she whispered. That night, something shifted between them. Not a declaration, not even a promise, but an unspoken agreement. A beginning. They started eating lunch together in the garden when the weather allowed. Valerie learned that Andrew had left Michigan for a while after graduation, taken odd jobs across the Midwest, and eventually returned to Evanston to help his father after the stroke. "My dad was never the easiest man," he said once, pulling a weed from the soil. "But when he got sick, I knew I had to come back." She nodded. "You two seem close now." "We weren't always. But he changed. Or maybe I did." Valerie had noticed that change too. Benjamin Carter, once described by his former nurses as tough as nails, had become something else with her. Thoughtful, warm, even playful. He asked about her day, her interests, her favorite authors. He called her Kid with a kind of affection that reminded her, painfully, of the father she no longer called. One afternoon, as Valerie stood at the sunroom window watching Andrew rake leaves into neat piles, Benjamin spoke without lifting his eyes from his newspaper. "He's a good man," he said. "Andrew." She glanced over. "I know." Benjamin folded the paper and set it aside. "You're good for each other." Valerie blinked, surprised. "You think so?" He gave her a look, the kind that peeled away pretense. "Don't play dumb, sweetheart. I might be old, but I'm not blind." She laughed, embarrassed. "I wasn't sure anyone noticed." "Of course we notice. It's not the kind of thing you can hide. You two light up when you're near each other. The real kind of light. Not the kind you buy." Valerie didn't reply. She just stared out the window, the warmth rising in her cheeks, too soft to fight. That weekend, Andrew knocked gently on the side door of the house, just as Valerie was finishing up in the kitchen. He held up a folded flyer. "There's a movie night at the Evanston Theater. Classic double feature. You still hate romantic films." She smiled. "They've grown on me." He raised an eyebrow. "That a yes?" "That's a yes." The theater was quiet and half full, mostly older couples and college kids on budget dates. They sat near the back, sharing a bucket of popcorn that neither admitted was too salty. On screen, a black and white couple danced through a rainstorm, kissing under a flickering street lamp. Valerie leaned closer without realizing it. Andrew's hand brushed against hers, and neither of them moved away. As they walked back toward the house that night, the wind tugging at her coat, she realized something she hadn't dared to admit out loud. She was falling for him. Again. But this time, there was no audience, no college friends, no expectations. Just two people walking side by side through the quiet streets of a life they never planned, but maybe always needed. The days that followed were quieter, but not in an empty way. Valerie found herself moving through the Carter home with a new sense of peace, as if some long-clenched part of her had finally begun to soften. She smiled more often, genuinely now, without forcing it, and found herself humming when she washed the dishes, folding blankets in the sunroom with a kind of gentle joy she couldn't remember ever feeling before. Andrew came by each morning just the same, but now there was a new rhythm between them. The way he looked at her had changed, or maybe she'd only just learned how to really see it. It wasn't infatuation, not the headlong rush of youth. It was steadier than that. Like warmth after winter. Like home. Sometimes they'd sit outside after her shift ended, drinking coffee on the back steps, sharing stories about all the small, stupid things that used to feel big. Andrew told her about a trip to Wyoming where he got food poisoning in a tent and thought he was dying. She told him about the time she dyed her hair red in high school, and her father flew in a stylist from New York to fix it. She didn't talk much about her father now, not because it hurt too much, but because she had made peace with the silence he left behind. She didn't need him to come back. She had built something of her own now, something she never could have imagined during those years of polished dinner parties and empty conversations. Benjamin Carter, too, had become a part of her healing. The old man had a habit of pretending to doze off, only to interrupt conversations with startling precision when you least expected it. He'd become her quiet champion, offering the kind of wisdom that didn't need to be explained twice. Love's not about timing, he told her one afternoon, eyes closed, voice low. It's about showing up and staying. That same evening, as Valerie helped him settle into bed, he reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said. "Good reminder or bad?" He smiled. "Best kind. The kind that makes you wish you'd said more sooner." A few nights later, Andrew walked her home for the first time. It wasn't far, 10 minutes through quiet streets, and she didn't ask why he suddenly offered. She just nodded, pulled on her coat, and matched his pace. They walked in silence for most of it, their steps slow, unhurried. There was something sacred in the way the street lamps stretched their shadows across the sidewalk. When they reached her building, she turned to say good night, but he spoke first. "Valerie," he said, and her name sounded like something pulled from memory, not habit. She looked up, heart already quickening. "I need to tell you something," he said. She nodded, unsure why her breath caught. "I'm not the gardener." She blinked, confused. "I mean, I do the work. I've always loved the work. But I'm not just that." She stared, waiting. "My father's Benjamin Carter," he said. "I'm his son. I live there. I run a company now, renewable energy, mostly. That's what I do when I'm not out in the yard, pretending I still need the break." Valerie didn't move. "I didn't lie to hurt you," he said gently. I remembered the way we ended. How you once said we came from different worlds. And I didn't want that to be the reason you stayed. I wanted you to see me. Just me." For a long, stretching moment, neither of them said anything. A car passed on the road. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then went quiet again. Valerie stepped forward and put her hands on his chest, over the damp fabric of his coat. "I saw you the moment you looked up from those roses," she whispered. "And I've been seeing you clearer ever since." He exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath for years. "I'm not afraid of who you are," she said. "Not anymore. You're not the boy chasing someone out of reach." and I'm not the girl too afraid to admit she needed more than status and safety. We're different now." She paused. "Better." He smiled, soft and certain. "I love you," he said. She smiled back. "And I never stopped," she whispered. It was the kind of kiss that didn't ask permission. The kind that belonged somewhere between an apology and a promise. And when it finally broke, neither of them stepped back. A month later, under the arbor that Andrew had rebuilt by hand, Valerie stood in a dress that wasn't designer, with her hair pinned up the way she liked it best, simple, soft, her favorite pair of crescent earrings glinting just below her jawline. Benjamin sat at the front, Kane resting beside his chair, a quiet, proud light in his eyes. The wedding was small. No orchestra. No crystal chandeliers. Just family, a few friends, and rows of garden chairs lined up beneath a sky that stayed perfectly clear. After the ceremony, Andrew pulled Valerie aside and took her hand. "There's one more thing," he said, pressing a key into her palm. She looked down. "It's to the house," he said. "Our house now, if you want it. I want to build a life there, with you." Her eyes filled, not with surprise, but with certainty. "Yes," she whispered. 100 times yes. She didn't care that she used to live in a mansion. She didn't care about the account balances, or the stock portfolios, or the headlines on other people's lives. Because here in this moment, with the man who once wrote her papers and raked her garden just to be close, she finally understood something her old life had never taught her. That love, when it's real, doesn't look for perfection. It grows slowly, patiently, like a rose in the cold ground, waiting for the right season. And when it blooms, it's unstoppable.